Greetings and welcome to another segment on spiritual alliances and alcohol and other drug addiction rehabilitation. We've defined spirituality and we've reached a point now where we are reconnecting in relation to the issue of addiction and how spirituality relates to that. We talked about the experiences that our spirituality enjoys through our human existence, and we have hinted to the fact that a lot of times as we were growing up, we didn't master spiritual approaches to transformation. And so our transformative processes were, how can I put it, degraded, contaminated, maladapted, because instead of transforming, optimizing our spirituality, we kind of transformed using shortcuts. We kind of transformed without the aid of our spirituality, which means that we transformed without the end result being the fact that you and I would have, what, dominion over the earth. And so before we realized it, what happened? We weren't having dominion over our bodies. We weren't having dominion over the plants. We weren't having dominion over much of anything relative to the earth. And so the command to have dominion over the earth is reversed. And if you are really interested in that concept, I would love to get permission from, his name is Bishop John Cherry, and share, or you could get the tape, Are the Plants Laughing at You? It really hones in on that concept. For the duration of this program, I want to talk about the spiritual model of addiction now that we've laid the groundwork to understand what's going on. Earlier in another part of the series, we talked about the various models of addiction, and we identified the third model relative to the spiritual model. And the spiritual model assumes that the issue is a function of a spiritual deficit that one is attempting to accommodate, to fill with alcohol, other drugs, or other aspects of our compulsive behavior. And so the rehabilitation or the intervention would be what? To recognize the inappropriate aspect of our beingness, unlearn it, and substitute it with what? Spirituality. And this is where the fun begins. When we talk in terms of recognizing the dysfunction, that's usually what? Recognizing and defining the addiction or the compulsion. Recognizing and perhaps defining the source of the addiction compulsion. The more you know about it, the easier it is to truly transcend it. Once we recognize the addiction or the compulsion, a lot of times we have an addiction or compulsion, but we don't realize that. You've heard it. You've said it probably. I can stop this, whatever it is, anytime I want. And then when someone challenges you, you find out you can't. Once we recognize that we're in the land of addiction, we begin to identify perhaps the spiritual deficits in relation to the predicament. The spiritual model says there's a deficit. One might say there's a hole in my soul. There is a disconnection between my soul, which is will, intellect, attitude, belief systems, values, and my spiritual aspect of my being. To the extent that my anxiety level is heightened. We've already talked about anxiety and spirituality being at two ends of a spectrum. Now, that doesn't mean that they're both not God-given. They are both God-given, and God gives us anxiety for a purpose. And the purpose is this: if you and I are feeling anxious, then we're not in a spiritual place at that time. People have often asked me, well, how do I know when God's talking to me? How do I know when I'm in touch with my inner self? How do I know when the universe is in line, or when I'm in line with the universe? And it's simple. When you and I are not feeling anxious, we're in line. And when we are feeling anxious, we're out of line. Go with your gut. Go with your feelings. The problem with addiction is the fact that we found a substitute for spirituality. And instead of optimizing who we are that predates birth, is with us while we're here on earth, and postdates death, we start getting preoccupied with things that are not real, things that are not eternal, things that change on you. And anything that changes on you is not real. Your body is not real. It changes. Your belief system, not real. It changes. The thing that doesn't change is your spirituality. So what happens is we get preoccupied with the things of the world, and we get preoccupied to the point where we see that as our source of life, and it is not. You get nervous about your job when you see your job as your source of survival. You get nervous about your reputation when you see your reputation as the source of your success. You get nervous about your life when you see your body as your source for life. All of these are examples of us losing our way somewhere along the journey. The job is the universe's way to pay you. But the universe is going to take care of you regardless of the job. Your body is the universe's way of experiencing itself. But you, as part of the universe, is going to exist after your body has given up. When we look at things that are changeable and we establish them as eminent to our existence, we're in trouble. And that's what happens in relation to the spiritual model. We begin to put our well-being in situations that change. Think about it. Who wouldn't be anxious if their life was perceived to be based on something that changes, on something that's not real? That's enough to make any of us nervous and anxious. And so there is the deficit. We've substituted our perception of well-being from a spiritual source to a changeable source, from a true and real source to a pseudo source. And there is the anxiety, because you know it's not real, and you know that when we're feeling anxious, we're feeling vulnerable, and that vulnerability, that feeling, that perception of vulnerability occurs. Why? Because you know that you're depending on something that you can't depend on. So we have this spiritual deficit, and we try to make up for it with artificial approaches: alcohol, other drugs. I mentioned in an earlier broadcast that alcohol is still called in many circles spirits, as are other drugs called spirits. Why? Cheap imitations of the real thing. Spirituality is supposed to help us through the night, not a fifth of Johnny Walker Red. Spirituality is supposed to open our eyes, not a hallucinogenic experience. When we substitute the role of spirituality with other things, there is the deficit, the spiritual deficit. Now, when we talk in terms of spiritual interventions, I'm going to identify, I'm going to call it the star of the show. It was introduced through Alcoholics Anonymous, but it is not the Alcoholics Anonymous experience that allows the concept of spirituality to shine through. It's the 12 steps that inform the Alcoholics Anonymous tradition that is the star. And for purposes of simplicity, we can concentrate on the first 2 steps, because there lies the foundation for the other 10. And there lies the foundation that if we get it right, we can understand why the 12 steps is seen as a spiritual model. It is a model of transcendence. It can move us along to the point that we are so self-actualized that we are detached from other things. Now, I'm talking about the first 2 steps because in my research relative to spirituality, I have found that the resolution of those first 2 steps is essential, and too often, in relation to the 12 steps, they are often misconceived, misunderstood, and misapplied. And for that reason, we will have people in a 12-step program identifying with behavior that has long ended. You've heard it. My name is so-and-so and I am a such and such. Now, I'm not saying that that approach is totally dysfunctional. It does keep you clean and sober, but it does not allow you to enter into the land of transcendence where you are so unattached that you don't need to remind yourself about that. It's kind of like trying to move forward looking backwards. It really doesn't capture the concept of optimizing our spirituality. Let's look at the first step, where we are instructed to own our predicament, to own who we are. It is great to own who we are. That is part of the spiritual journey. We call it confession. And we're told what? Confession is good for the soul. Well, it is good for the soul, because it helps our perspective, it helps our belief system, it helps our attitude, it helps our emotion. Yes, it is good for the soul. But if indeed our confession is contaminated with shame and guilt, it is not good for the soul. Confession is good for the soul when we can confess and, as a result of that, experience innocence. And when we can't do that, confession is concrete that we've stepped into and we can't step out. When we talk about that first step, when we identify the fact that we are experiencing alcohol consumption in our being human, please know it is not supposed to be a permanent state. We're talking about transcending. How do I ensure that my experiencing alcohol consumption is not real? How do I ensure that? By recognizing the fact that in my experience as a human, I have had an association with alcohol. Here's what happens too often. Shame. I become that which I experienced. My name is so-and-so and I am a such and such. No, you're not a such and such. You were involved in behavior for a while. So the shame of it all has to be released in that first step of the 12 steps in order for us to what? Truly implement the spiritual model. Another component associated with that first step is called guilt. The guilt of it all. I think it's very arrogant to be guilty. And a lot of people who indulge spirituality would agree. You know, it's amazing how you and I have the audacity to think that we are ultimately, absolutely responsible for all of the things that happen to us. Now, you can take that stance in a state of innocence, but when you take it relative to judgment, it gets contaminated. Guilt is where you and I assume total responsibility for everything that's happening in our lives. We act as if we're God. Yes, I will agree, there's a part of us that is one with God. But if I have an encounter with you, you and I had to agree on it, which means that if this encounter doesn't go well for you, I'm not going to take total responsibility for it, you see. We agreed on it. Now, that's one way of looking at it. And if you look at it that way, guilt doesn't have a place in this. We're innocent, experiencing things. If we don't want to take full responsibility, then it's even easier to challenge the concept of guilt. Because if I don't take full responsibility, then I can't be guilty because I wasn't in total control. So whether you want to take full responsibility or whether you want to share the responsibility, guilt, which is what? Assuming absolute responsibility, is not appropriate. It just doesn't work that way. Think about it. The first step is owning the behavior. When you think about the issue of denial, when you think about the inability to own something, it usually comes because of shame and guilt. I just think it's amazing how we expect people to confess things, and we know that the confession is going to bring shame and guilt. People are not stupid. Even kids know better than to do that. If I confess something and I know that you're going to judge me for it, common sense is going to tell me not to do it. A child, you catch a child in the kitchen, in the cookie jar, crumbs around his mouth, cookies in his hand. You got a switch in your hand. You say, have you eaten those cookies? Of course the child is going to say no. And that's the problem with the issue of shame and guilt. When we can see ourselves as innocent, we own everything. We own everything. Why? Because we're just experiencing it. And there is no shame and guilt associated with it. Now, that doesn't mean that we're irresponsible. Actually, innocence allows us to own responsibility even better. And the innocence is the part that is spiritual. Remember, we were spirit before we hit earth, and we're going to be spirit after we hit earth, and our experiences on earth from a spiritual perspective take away the whole concept of guilt. Takes away the whole concept of shame. Takes away the whole concept of judging. You know, we were told what? Not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That meant what? Don't get in the business of deciding what's right and wrong. Now, I'm just using that as the perspective, but every holy book tells you what? You got to be innocent. You got to be innocent. And we find these ways to become innocent. Well, innocence correlates with spirituality. So with that first step, in order for it to work for me, I have to own whatever it was or whatever it is that I'm doing without the shame and guilt. I own it in innocence. I am a spiritual being. I have had experience with alcohol. I recognize it and I will grow from it. So you can do that when you take an objective view. Now the second step is equally challenging. It is foundational, but if we don't get it right, we're going to be in trouble. And that is the infamous looking to a power greater than ourselves. Now, the looking to the power greater than ourselves begins to let us know there's something bigger than us out there. There's God, there's the Holy Spirit, there's the universe, there's the great I am. Ooh, it's bigger than I am. No problem with that. But if we're dealing with addiction or compulsion, we have to recognize that the power is within us. And too often with that second step, we have a situation where we project the power onto something else. And that negates our spirituality. People do it all the time. God is good, but they're terrible. Well, God is good, they're good. And then they take their shadows and they project that on the devil. The devil made me do it. Well, excuse me, it is time that we start taking responsibility for our behavior and that we recognize that we're not supposed to give place to the adversary, which means I'm not giving the devil, the adversary, whatever you want to call it, credit for nothing. Everything is good. The kids told you that, it's all good. The old folks told you how to do it. There's a bright side somewhere. Don't stop till you find it. What is that doing? It's informing our capacity to identify with who we really are. Yes, there is a power greater than you, greater than me. There is a power greater than myself that moves me beyond seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, and smelling. It moves me beyond this human experience. That's the greater than myself. It's greater than my humanness. How do I know? Because it preceded my birth and it post-dates my death. So there's a power greater than my human experience that I must tap into to overcome this thing. There's a power greater than my human experience that I must tap into to stay sane. There's a power greater than my human experience with which I must identify so that I won't be anxious. Anxiety will drive you to insanity. So when we talk about that second step, know this: the power has to be in you in order for you to truly be it. I cannot look to something external as greater than myself, because now all I've done is established another crutch, another pseudo way of managing my anxiety. Instead, I want to identify this power that predates my birth and postdates my death and is with me now. I want to identify it as part of who I am, because quite honestly, that's the only real part of who you are. That's the only eternal part of who you are. And to externalize it creates what we call a spiritual deficit, because now you still got the hole in your soul. Why? Because the spirituality that was supposed to complete who you are, the spirituality that you landed on planet Earth with, the spirituality that was with you even before you got your meat suit, is being projected onto something else. So as far as your soul is concerned, as far as your attitude, your belief systems are concerned, there's nothing there to control it, to empower it, to move it ahead. And so with that second step, we must remember that the power that transcends who we are, the power that moves us up the diagonal line to self-actualization, the power that is talked about in that trans-theoretical model has to be a power that is in us. And to externalize it keeps us in a spiritual deficit. Now, once we get these two steps in the right perspective, we got it made. The first step being what? Yes, I'm going to own what I have experienced. See, when we see it as experiencing it, we are innocent. I'm going to own what I have experienced without the shame and guilt. Then the first step is a launching pad. And the second step, the power that is greater than my humanity is not outside of who I am. It is inside of who I am. That power is what is fed through the breath. That power is the spirituality. That power is the energy that is going to leave my body one day, but it doesn't stop existing. So that power that is greater than my body, that power that is greater than my will, intellect, attitude, and belief system will what? Move me beyond the situation that I'm in. When we get those two steps down, then the 12 steps are a launching pad. And it moves us all the way through the process to transcendence. The match study identifies it as best practices right there with the cognitive behavior model and the motivational interviewing model. What I have learned from experience is we got to get those first two steps right in order for it to move us to transcendence. We do not want to live the rest of our lives saying, my name is so-and-so and I am a such and such. My name is Marjorie and I am a fix-it pill junkie. No, 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 no. That has to be eradicated. And through a spiritual interpretation of a power that is within us and that transcends us, we can do it. Without it, we will still have holes in our souls. It's exciting to be able to see things from a spiritual perspective. It's exciting to be able to know that when we can identify the power of God, the power of spirituality, the power of the great I am, our true selves, when we can identify that, and we can know that nothing can hurt that, when we can identify with that, we are able to, what? Recognize that the plants can only laugh at us for so long. Because in our spirituality, not only do we hear the command to have dominion over the earth, but through the spirituality that was always innocent, we are reestablished in our rightful places. They call it grace and mercy. And I'm so glad that that spiritual model has room for that in our transcending addiction and compulsion. I would love to share with you more insight. We have a protocol that we can use in relation to an intervention. There are techniques that we can use to directly manage anxiety. And it's all available if you would like to contact me. Spirituality is seen as one of the best models. It works on par with other best practices. It's the oldest game in town, and it has the lowest rate of recidivism. We have to remember, the only thing real is our spirituality. And spirituality will move us beyond even our addictions. And in our spirituality, we can take our rightful place, having dominion over our earthen vessels and the earth. On that note, I'm going to wish you fortune on your spiritual journey, and I look forward to sharing with you again. Goodbye.